And now, it's really a great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you our featured scholar for this evening, Michael Lower. He is the Morse Alumni Distinguished University Teaching Professor of History at the University of Minnesota on the Twin Cities campus, where he is taught, I think it's accurate to say, for all of the current millennium, including teaching a class called Soccer Around the World with the Beautiful Game. He writes about the Crusades, about mercenaries, medieval Mediterranean history, soccer, and 20th century Jewish history. Dr. Lower received his PhD in medieval history in 1999 from Cambridge University, where he worked with David Abulafia and Jonathan Riley Smith. In 2010 and 11, thanks to a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship, he spent a year studying classical Arabic and early Islamic history at the University of Chicago. And his research on the Crusades tries to bring together Arabic and European language sources to tell the story of these complex multilateral conflicts from multiple perspectives, exploring how medieval people from across the Mediterranean world confronted many kinds of diversity. He is the author of The Barons' Crusade of 1239, A Call to Arms and Its Consequences, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2005, and The Tunis Crusade of 1270, A Mediterranean History, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. He is currently working on a history of Hakoah Vienna, an all-Jewish soccer club that conquered Austrian football, beat the English at their own game, and defied the Nazis. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Michael Lower.
Wow, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction, Natan. That was super, super nice. I was gonna say it's so nice to see so many old friends, but actually I can't see anybody up here, to be honest, from this view, and at least I should probably say dear friends, right, given the demographics involved. Okay, so let's dive right into the story. The club president called the victory Hakoah's highest sporting accomplishment. The club manager said it was the greatest triumph in the history of Jewish sports. Now you have to bear in mind he didn't know about Sandy Koufax. The president of the Austrian Republic himself telegraphed his congratulations. At a celebratory rally after the game, two old friends of Herzl addressed the crowds. Joseph Cohen proclaimed, "Your victory is not only a sporting accomplishment, but a Jewish world event." The Reverend William H. Heckler, an advisor to Herzl and one-time chaplain of the British Embassy in Vienna, tinged his congratulations with a note of regret. Young people, why did Theodor Herzl not get to see such a victory? The next day, the Austrian ambassador, Baron Frankenstein, or was it Frankenstein? And this is who he was. I did not make it up. He received the team, and he told the team that they had done more for Austrian international relations than any politician. When their train home reached the Austrian border, deputations from the leading Viennese soccer clubs met them with flowers. At the train station in Vienna, thousands of people waited to greet them. There was no room for the players to get off the train in the main entry hall, so they had to disembark in the freight station instead. The railway band actually hustled over and played a victory march for the team. What had Hakoah done to deserve presidential telegraphs, ambassadorial receptions, teary-eyed reminiscences from companions of Herzl, bouquets of flowers, and musical serenades? On September 3rd, 1923, they had beaten West Ham United 5-0 in a soccer game at Upton Park in London. They'd gone to the country where the sport was invented and beaten one of its best teams. So, West Ham United. West Ham United had appeared in the FA Cup final the previous spring. The FA Cup final is the world's oldest knockout cup competition, and by some distance, its most glamorous. In the 1920s, the FA Cup final was the pinnacle of the English football season. In 1923, the game had a special resonance because it was played at the newly opened Wembley Stadium, which is kind of the national stadium for English soccer. In the pre-radio, pre-television era, some 300,000 people came to Wembley to try to watch the match, vastly more than the stadium's capacity, which is about 120,000. And so you can see in the picture here, it's called the White Horse Final because here's Billy, the famous white horse. He was actually gray, but that's how he showed up in the photographs, trying to clear the crowds from the field so that they could actually play the match. So Hakoah had beaten one of the most famous clubs in the world. The nature of the win was special too. Football is a low-scoring game. Matches often end 0-0, 1-0, or 2-1 when things get really exciting. So how to put this? 5-0 was an epic beatdown. The win was not just big, but historic. Prior to Hakoah, no foreign team had ever beaten an English opponent on English soil. So Hakoah had done more than enough to earn a victory march. One question for tonight is how they did it. How did an all-Jewish team from Vienna, amateur at the time, defeat a giant of the English game? Another question is more somber. What happened to the heroes of Upton Park when the Nazis descended on Vienna in 1938? Like all good sports stories, this one starts with dentistry. Or at least a dentist. Ignaz Hermann Kerner, it must be said, did not care all that much about his day job. Growing up in Bohemia in the late 19th century, he had fallen hard for football and played it at the highest amateur level. When he moved to Vienna to study at the university there, he found that he was far from alone in his obsession with the sport. By the early 1900s, there were actually over 70 clubs active in the city. Jewish kids were just as keen as their Gentile neighbors to play the sport. Kerner would see them kicking the ball around the abandoned lots of the city on his way back and forth from work. But he noticed that few of them played in organized matches. Some clubs, in fact, had an informal rule that banned Jews from joining them. Others explicitly banned Jews from playing, actually laid out in club bylaws, which would contain what was called an Aryan paragraph, which would restrict membership to non-Jews. Excluding Jews from football made Ignaz Kerner mad, especially since he was starting to see the sport as something more than just recreation. Kerner was a Zionist. He had known Herzl as a young man, and by 1909 he was chair of the Inner Austrian Zionist District Committee. He knew all about the speech Max Nordau had given to the Second Zionist Congress in Basel in 1898. As Herzl's chief lieutenant at the World Zionist Organization, Nordau had called for a new kind of Judaism, what he called muscle Judaism. And here he is. We must think of creating once again a Jewry of muscles. In the narrow Jewish street, our poor limbs soon forgot their joyful movements. In the dimness of sunless houses, our eyes began to blink shyly. The fear of constant persecution turned our powerful voices into frightened whispers, which rose in a crescendo only when our martyrs on the stakes cried out their dying prayers in the face of their executioners. But now, all coercion has become a memory of the past, and at last we are allowed space enough for our bodies to live again. Let us take up our oldest traditions. Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. So young Jewish men, in Nordau's vision, would have to strengthen their bodies in order to build a Jewish state. But here's the part that's so interesting to me. While Nordau focused on gymnastics, which was carried out as a kind of almost quasi-militaristic activity in those days, Kerner's genius, I think, was to recognize soccer as the phenomenon of the future. In 1909, he got together with a cabaret librettist and famous librettist for the operetta named Fritz Beda Lohner and founded Hakoah Vienna as a football club, naming the club after the Hebrew word for strength. Kerner's vision for Hakoah could not have been grander. Yes, it would give Jews a chance to play the game they loved, but that was just the start. When young Jewish men played football, they could show off their strength and courage. They could defy stereotypes of Jews as weak and cowardly. When they won together, they would realize what they could accomplish together as Jews. In an era when many favored assimilating into the majority, these athletes would become self-aware about their Jewish identity. Thus indoctrinated, a new vanguard of Jewish youth would take shape, ready to fight for a Jewish national homeland. Well, Kerner's plan to regenerate the Jewish people through sports began with a 10-0 loss for the soccer team. At first, Hakoah played in a flood zone of the Danube. Then the team moved to better quarters, the Bernerplatz in Floridsdorf, a tough Vienna suburb. The field was next to the municipal waste dump. All the horse manure generated in Vienna, and this was in the early 1900s, was brought there every day by the cartload. The stench never left the pitch. Finding opponents willing to play there was not easy. The squad eventually joined the 4th division of the Austrian league, the lowest rung on the football ladder. Even that small step proved a challenge. At first, the Austrian Football Federation did not want to admit an ethno-nationalist club. Leading the objections was the federation's president, Dr. Ignaz Abelez, who was in fact Jewish. He told Kerner, "What, you want to establish a Jewish sports club? Then you would have 11 active members and 1,000 members of the board." That's what he said. Abelez worried that a Jewish national club would stoke anti-Semitism. Many Viennese Jews shared his skepticism about Hakoah. Vienna between the wars was home to about 180,000 Jews, about 10% of the city's total population. Like Dr. Abelez, many of them were bourgeois and assimilated. They were well represented in medicine, law, journalism, and the arts. They helped make 1920s Vienna a famous birthplace of modernity. Schoenberg revolutionized the classical tradition in music. Freud and Adler invented psychology. Zweig, Schnitzler, Krauss, and Torberg transformed literature and theater. But not all Viennese Jews spent their days in the cafes inventing psychoanalysis and atonality. A good portion of them were actually recent arrivals from the city, having fled persecution in the East. The newcomers were observant, they spoke Yiddish rather than German, and they often lived in poverty. The divide between the newcomers and the old-timers wasn't the only fault line that ran through Viennese Jewry. There were tensions between Zionists and assimilationists, between assimilationists and the Orthodox, and between the Orthodox and the Socialists. In fact, the only thing they could all agree on was that maybe a Jewish sports club was not such a good idea. The Orthodox opposed it on religious grounds, naturally. The Socialists decried it as hopelessly bourgeois, and the assimilationists feared it would stir up the anti-Semites. Assimilationist fears were unfortunately grounded in an unwelcome reality. In Hakoah's early days, anti-Semitism was on the rise in Vienna. The pioneer here was the populist Vienna mayor Karl Lueger, who mobilized racial resentment to win elections in the years prior to the First World War. The chaos that followed the Austro-Hungarian Empire's defeat in 1918 exacerbated the situation. The multi-ethnic empire that Vienna had presided over was gone, replaced by the tiny rump state of Austria. Vienna was now a grand imperial capital of 1.8 million people, with no empire left to rule. Its citizens struggled to survive amid a global pandemic, economic crises, high inflation, and political chaos. So it was nothing like our current situation at all. Scapegoats were sought. When riots broke out during the High Holy Days of 1919, the head of Vienna's police told Jewish community leaders that he could not guarantee the security of Leopoldstadt, the city's traditional Jewish neighborhood. And this is an image that juxtaposes a map showing Leopoldstadt just on the other side of the Danube, and this is a memorial to a synagogue that once stood in Leopoldstadt but was destroyed during Kristallnacht. So, the situation. The Jewish community is left to fend for itself in the face of anti-Semitic violence. In desperation, the leadership turned to Hakoah, which now boasted a wrestling section in addition to the soccer team. Hakoah athletes fanned out across Leopoldstadt, and, as the club history proudly notes, no Jew had a hair bent. The wrestling team also came in handy at the soccer games. Verbal abuse, people would shout Jewish pig, as a kind of weird oxymoron, and physical violence were quite routine at Hakoah soccer matches. More than once, the wrestlers had to escort the footballers off the field to protect them from rampaging spectators. At a game in Chemnitz, Germany in 1920, the referee blew his whistle in the middle of the match and shouted at the crowd to slay the Jews. The players fought their way through the crowd to the changing room, where they barricaded the door until the police could actually clear the stadium. Smelly fields, bad losses, the jeers of assimilationists, and even outright anti-Semitic violence. None of it could stop Hakoah from growing. Only at Hakoah could you test your strength against the Gentiles with the Star of David emblazoned on your chest. Or perhaps another part of your body. This is the Hakoah water polo team, a proud squad. Only in Hakoah colors could you display your strong Jewish body to the world. So here is Mickey Herschel, Hakoah's most famous wrestler, who actually was an Olympic medalist in the discipline. And here's Hedy Bienenfeld, one of Hakoah's greatest swimming champions, the Austrian champion in the 100-meter breaststroke, but who also worked as a fashion model. And Hakoah members were very proud of the bodies they had done so much to work on. And here's where the original image is from. This is a smoking magazine. So this is fitness was different in those days. Okay. While some parents had their doubts about Hakoah, the kids flocked to the club. The great Austrian writer Friedrich Thorberg explains why. I was a Hakoah supporter from the ripe old age of 10. How that influenced my later life, I do not even know. It not only influenced my standing vis-a-vis Judaism, it determined it. I had the invaluable fortune to grow up as a witness to Hakoah victories, together with Hakoah becoming great. I had the invaluable fortune never, not for 1 second, to have to be ashamed of my Judaism. For what reason would I have to be ashamed? Because the Jews scored more goals and swam faster and boxed better than any others? I was a kid when I noticed all of this. I was from childhood proud of being a Jew. And this pride, which I would not give up for all the world, remains for all time connected with the name Hakoah. By the early 1920s, Hakoah was the biggest sports club in Vienna, boasting over 2,500 members. It had sections for wrestling, as I said, but also for boxing, swimming, track and field, water polo, fencing, chess, tennis, ice hockey, field hockey, skiing. They actually had a hut in the Alps and a full orchestra. But soccer remained the center of club life. The best Jewish players on other Viennese clubs began to join the team. Jewish footballers from farther afield followed, especially from Hungary. What might seem a weakness in the Hakoah model, that recruitment was limited to one group, was actually a competitive advantage. Most soccer teams in Vienna recruited locally and rarely looked beyond their own backyards for talent. Hakoah drew the best Jewish players from across Central Europe. Hakoah became a Jewish all-star team, and that team became a juggernaut. In July 1920, Hakoah defeated its arch-rival, Germania, to win promotion to the first division. Hakoah had fought its way off the dung heap to reach the top flight of Austrian football. Now, playing in the first division was expensive. The club actually operated at a loss and had to organize summer tours to pay the bills. Poland and Germany were the most frequent destinations at first. This is on the left. This is them setting off for Poland in an airplane. So if you ever are unhappy with your Delta seat selection, just things could be a lot worse. But the club started off really in Poland and Germany, and they would hit them every summer, but eventually they toured the world. And they played in Lithuania, France, Mandate Palestine, Algeria, Egypt, and the United States. Because of the large crowds it tended to attract, Hakoah was also a popular opponent for clubs wanting to visit Vienna. In 1922, West Ham United asked to play there. But the English Football Association denied them permission because it banned English clubs from playing against former war enemies. West Ham broached the idea of Hakoah. Could it offer an exception as a Jewish club? Interestingly, the FA gave way, and West Ham became the first team from an Allied country to play in Austria since the war. On May 19, 1923, Hakoah played West Ham to a 1-1 draw. Hakoah had helped Austria pull off a bit of a diplomatic coup. 50,000 people had watched the match, the largest crowd ever for a football match in Vienna up to that time. Impressed by the attendance figures and a little disappointed by the result, West Ham asked Hakoah for a rematch in London. Hakoah jumped at the chance to become the first Austrian side to play in the motherland of football. On August 29, 1923, the Hakoah traveling party set off for London. 18 players made the trip, among whom were several stars of the Austrian game. The club captain was defender Max Scheuer. He was a Hakoah true believer and a regular campaigner for Zionist causes. He had joined the club back in 1912 and was known for playing, it was kind of strange, he was known for playing with a constant grin on his face. So the other team always thought he was kind of taking the mickey, but he actually, this was out of tension, not out of like joy. He was just so nervous when he played. And he was actually so intense that he once slapped a Hakoah teammate for giving up a goal late in a game that cost Hakoah a match. Midfield, also pretty intense. Looking at this gentleman right here, the midfield star player was Bela Gutmann. Gutmann had arrived in Vienna from Hungary in the winter of 1921 with basically one pair of ripped pants to his name. Kerner noticed in the Hakoah clubhouse that Gutmann would always be standing next to the stove whenever he came inside to keep warm. Once the club actually managed to buy Gutmann a proper pair of pants, he settled into the team. After his playing career, he went on to become one of the greatest managers in the history of world football, twice leading Benfica of Portugal to the European Cup. So he was famous for this managerial dictum: the third year is fatal, which I think speaks to his sardonic sense of humor. In other words, don't stay at the club more than 3 years. The players will hate you. It speaks to his sardonic sense of humor and also to his wandering existence after the war. He moved from club to club. On the field, as a player, he was the link man, breaking up attacks and advancing the ball to the forwards. His favorite passing target was Alexander Neufeld Nemes, who came from Budapest in 1919. He was in many ways the classic striker, selfish in front of goal, and handy with the comb and the hair gel. He loved a practical joke too, especially if it involved fake gunplay, pulling aged doctors onto moving trains, and pretending that freshly grown grass provoked suicidal despair, especially in soccer players. Joining the players on the trip were more than 20 other club members, including several wives of the players, club president Kerner, section leader Arthur Barr, and the club's English trainer, notice English trainer, Billy Hunter. Just as few Vienna teams recruited players as broadly as Hakoah, few employed coaches from abroad. Hakoah was traveling to London with more cards up their sleeves than many suspected. Documenting the trip was the sports journalist Max Leute. He's left us a quirky but informative account of the whole adventure. Today, a 2.5-hour flight will get you from Vienna to London. In 1923, the journey took 3 days by train and ferry over 9 separate legs, and the club traveled third class to save money. As soon as the train left Vienna, the veterans initiated the first-timers into the traveling party by slapping their hands with a paddle until they turned violently red. They did that to everyone. The midfielder Felix Slutsky played Spanish ballads on his guitar to while away the time, which momentarily distracted the rest of the team from throwing tins of biscuits on each other's heads. At the Czech border, the players were aggrieved when the customs agents confiscated their good Viennese cigarettes. Again, training was different. Outside of Berlin, and this is eerie, the train halted when the conductor thought he spotted Hitler's brown shirts approaching. It turned out to be a false alarm. When they reached the Hook of Holland, the players braced for the Channel crossing. To ward off seasickness, some bought the dubious medications hawked by the locals. Others opted for a shot of Slivovitz. One player, and I think he was joking, suggested swallowing sealing wax to block his esophagus off from his stomach. Everybody ordered the so-called seasick prevention menu from the cafe, despite the outrageous price. Nothing seemed to work, though. Everybody was sick as dogs. The crossing was choppy, and the relief was palpable when the ferry finally docked at Harwich on August 31st. By the next day, the team were looking happy and somewhat recovered in London. And this is a beautiful photo of them decked out in their formal hats and their overcoats and their suits. It was Saturday, match day in England. The players went to the First Division League game between West Ham and Sunderland to scout out the opposition. They weren't impressed by what they saw. Arthur Barr reported that they saw good football, but absolutely nothing to scare them. To the contrary, the players became confident. They found the game to be fast-paced, but lacking in the tactical sophistication they were used to in Vienna. Time in a game, West Ham attacked in the same way. The ball would be played out wide to the winger, who would try to dribble past the opposing fullback and sprint down the sideline toward the corner flag, where he would send in a cross for the central striker to head at goal. Viennese teams, by contrast, were famous for what they called their combination play. The 5 forwards on the attacking line would overlap, switch positions, and exchange short passes to create scoring opportunities. They played, in other words, much more like a modern team. West Ham were actually behind the times, and the Hakoah players now knew that they were. At a players-only meeting the next day, Hakoah came up with its game plan. The key player was Alexander Neufeld-Nemes, the fun-loving right winger. He played in a totally different way than an English winger. Rather than run for the corner flag to swing in a cross, Nemes would dribble directly for goal. He had no interest in setting up others for shots. He wanted to score himself. His teammates usually begged him to be less egotistical on the pitch, but this time they encouraged him to indulge his selfish instincts to the full. His direct approach might take the West Ham team by surprise. The plan was sound, but it was still hard to imagine beating a team that had just played in a cup final in front of 300,000 fans. When the traveling party made their predictions for the final score, only one player was willing to anticipate a Hakoah victory. Kickoff was scheduled for 6 p.m. on Monday, September 3rd. Hakoah played its strongest lineup. Halpern in goal, Gold and Scheuer in defense, Kerr, Gutmann, and Pollock in midfield, and Nemes, Häusler, Grunwald, Hess, and Katz up front. Sometimes said that West Ham played a reserve team, but this is not strictly true. Because they had played Sunderland 48 hours before, some squad rotation was inevitable. Nevertheless, 4 players who had started in the FA Cup final in May, so presumably 4 of their best players, took the field against Hakoah, including the experienced defensive line of Billy Henderson and Jack Young. West Ham were not taking their opponents lightly. They started the game as if they meant to win it right away. They dominated possession and relentlessly attacked Hakoah's goal. To Max Leute, watching on from the press box, a debacle seemed imminent. But the defenders, Halpern, Scheuer, and Gold, remained calm. They won their tackles, played the ball out from the back, and radiated a sense of confidence that soon spread to the rest of the team. Playing alongside Gutmann in midfield, Häusler completed several short passes to the forward line. The Viennese combination game was starting to click. In the 24th minute, Häusler sprayed a pass out to Nemes on the right wing. Nemes controlled the ball and headed straight for goal rather than the corner flag, sprinting as if the devil were breathing down his neck, in the words of Arthur Barr. The West Ham fullback Billy Henderson was caught flat-footed and could only watch as Nemes ran unimpeded into the 18-yard box and struck the ball into the corner of the net. 7 minutes later, before West Ham could recover from the shock, Nemes did exactly the same thing again. Liberated from the responsibility of passing to teammates, or at least from the guilt of not passing to teammates, Nemes had brought Hakoah a 2-0 lead. At first, the English journalists pitied Leute because they thought he would have nothing nice to report back to Vienna. When Nemes scored the first goal, the reporters put it down to luck. When he scored the second, they offered congratulations. A white-haired veteran of the press box turned to Leute and said, "Now Hakoah can no longer lose with a 0 because their players have already managed 2 honorable strikes." Condescending? Moi? The English reporter's complacency was shattered a few minutes before halftime. This time it was the left winger who did the damage. Katz received the ball in space, sneaked it between the legs of his marker, and finished past the keeper to make it 3-0. This was a turning point in the match. It was not just that West Ham would have to score 4 times to win. Katz had executed his move, which is known as a nutmeg, on a defender who played for the English national team, one of the best defenders in the world, supposedly. Nutmegs are meant to embarrass. Leute looked across the press box to see how the white-haired English journalist would react, but he was nowhere to be found. At halftime, the Hakoah players debated how to approach the rest of the game. Should they defend their lead or stay on the attack? They decided on all-out attack. And here's Grunwald launching one. 2 minutes after the restart, Nemes struck again. For the 3rd time, and you have to start questioning the learning curve of the West Ham defenders at this point, he popped up in the middle of the park and blasted in over the stunned keeper, Tommy Hampson. Alois Hess scored the 5th goal to complete the rout. Hess was the most observant member of the team. Once on a Hakoah American tour, he had walked 12 miles from the team hotel to the stadium in Philadelphia to avoid breaking the Sabbath. Luckily, the West Ham match was played on a Monday. Hess certainly looked fresh when he beat 2 defenders and rounded Hampson to score. When the final whistle blew, hundreds of fans stormed the field, this time in joy rather than violence. They carried the Hakoah players off the pitch in triumph. No banquet was held to celebrate the victory. Instead, the players ate Viennese sausage and drank lemonade in a small smokehouse in Whitechapel. As they ate, they could hear the neighborhood kids chanting in the street. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sound made the simple meal taste delicious indeed. The team also loved the welcome that they received back in Vienna. For probably the first time in their lives, they experienced complete social acceptance. Everywhere they went, they were lionized as Austrian heroes. No one at the club was naive enough to think that this acceptance was unconditional or indefinite. The Jewish city councilor, Dr. Leopold Plaschkes, reminded them of the real nature of their achievement. With us in Austria, it goes like this. That when a Jew has great plans, he is likely to be laughed at by the others. If the work fails, then it is Jewish cheek. If it succeeds, then it is a success for others. The Jewish Hakoah want to send their football team to England. Who did not laugh about the Jews? Had you lost 5-0, it would have been a Jewish impudence from the beginning. Now, since you have won, everyone shouts out, Austrian sporting success! We are happy from the heart that you have represented the Republic so brilliantly, and through your and our Jewish colors so honored Austrian sport. But we confirm this. It is and remains a Jewish success. A success of Jewish bodies, of Jewish spirits and wills, and Jewish action. Hakoah had played at Upton Park as exemplars of a Jewish national ideal. But the club had wanted recognition for representing Austrian football as well. Dr. Plaschkes was making it clear that such acceptance depended on results. Austrians were happy to appropriate a famous win, but this was as far as the social identification went. Hakoah would always be Jewish. They could only be fully Austrian if they won. Hakoah kept on winning when they got home from London. In 1924, 1925, they won the Austrian League, which was probably the best in Europe at the time. Hakoah could now claim, with some justification, to be the best team on the continent. They were a sensation to Jewish communities around the world. Invitations to play friendly matches flew in from all over, even from the supposedly soccer-adverse United States. In the spring of 1926, Hakoah toured the U.S. At the old Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan, Hakoah beat a New York All-Star team 4-0 in front of 46,000 fans. That remained the largest attendance at a soccer match in the U.S. until the 1970s, when Pelé came to the U.S. But the American tour ultimately proved the team's undoing. Lured by higher wages, 8 players signed with American clubs in the summer of 1926. The following year, another 4 followed them. America, unfortunately, had loved the great Hakoah team to death. When the Great Depression wiped out the American League in 1929, many Hakoah players returned to Austria. The situation there was ominous. In 1933, a homegrown fascist dictatorship seized power. So that regime was anti-Nazi and actually allowed Hakoah to operate. The Anschluss of March 12, 1938, however, changed everything. One day after the Austrian forced union with Germany, the Nazis legislated Hakoah out of existence. They seized Hakoah's sports ground in the Prater and expunged the team name from the league table. On March 16th, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Vienna. By August, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration was up and running. By the end of September, Eichmann was bragging that 50,000 Austrian Jews had been expelled from the country. Between 1938 and 1941, 140,000 Austrian Jews were forcibly emigrated. So let's track the fate of the Hakoah team. At the time of the Anschluss, 8 members of the Hakoah team that defeated West Ham no longer lived in Austria. Karl Trummer had gone to Berlin in 1923, but then used his Hakoah connections to find his way to London when the war broke out. Egon Pollock was in Mandate Palestine, as was Alois Hess. Felix Slutsky had emigrated to Argentina in 1924 and would help other Hakoah members to flee Austria after 1938. Fritz Kerr was nearby in Montevideo. Nemes was managing a team in Belgrade. He would make it to Mandate Palestine in 1940. Willie Halpern had moved to New York after injuring his knee. He worked there as a diamond cutter and was able to help Hakoah clubmates to escape from Europe after 1938. Moritz Häusler, who had laid on 2 of Nemes's goals at Upton Park, was working outside of Austria as well. The rest of the team fled Hakoah during and after 1938. Josef Grunfeld was imprisoned in Dachau, but was released in 1939. He made it to America, possibly with Halpern's help. Max Gold fled to Luxembourg, then crossed the border into Belgium, where he went underground and survived the war. Norbert Katz was brought to London by Valentin Rosenfeld, who was the head of the Hakoah swimming section. Maxi Grunwald had a sister in Rio de Janeiro who sponsored his immigration to Brazil. Karl Duldig escaped first to Switzerland, acquired papers there to travel to Singapore, crossed over from there to New Zealand, and finally settled in Australia, where he took up a successful career as a sculptor. Bela Gutmann, the midfielder, nearly did not make it. In January 1938, so 3 months before the Anschluss, Gutmann had obtained an entry visa for the United States. By early March, he was living with a cousin in New York. Safe and sound, we might think. But in August, incredibly, Gutmann returned to Europe to become the head coach at Újpest, a top Hungarian club. So Hungary at that time, just to put his decision into some context, was not under Nazi occupation. But when the war started, the Hungarian regime forced him to resign his position as head coach. He had to serve in the less visible role of team scout, and he continued in that role until the Nazis themselves occupied Hungary in March of 1944. When the roundups began, Gutmann found refuge with his Gentile girlfriend's brother. He hid in an unfinished attic, perching on narrow wooden beams for month after month. Then he decided that it would actually be safer to enter one of the labor camps, slave labor camps that the Nazis were setting up. But unfortunately, he decided to enter the camp just as the Nazis were beginning to send the workers to concentration camps. But Gutmann was able to jump out of the window of his barrack. Gutmann was able to jump out of the window of his barracks and was actually able to escape before he could be forced onto the train for Auschwitz. For Gutmann, winning the European Cup as a coach was nothing compared to surviving the Holocaust. That brings us to the Hakoah legend Max Scheuer, pictured here on the left in Marseille. So he played for the club from 1912 to 1930. After the Anschluss, Scheuer went to Marseille because France placed few restrictions on foreign footballers at that time. 1942, however, the Nazis began to round up Jewish athletes in southern France. Scheuer made plans to escape to Switzerland with a friend. When Scheuer showed up at the rendezvous, the friend had brought many others with him. Instead of 2 men trying to cross the border, 14 made the attempt. The large group could not escape the German border patrol. Scheuer was taken to the Drancy transport camp near Paris. On November 4th, 1942, he was deported to Auschwitz and killed. Of the traveling party of about 40 people who went to London in 1923, Scheuer was actually the only one to die in the Holocaust. The fate of the traveling party mirrored that of Hakoah members overall. The vast majority survived the Nazi onslaught. Club histories list 37 Hakoah members who died in the Holocaust. It's hard to put this figure into context. The precise survival rate for Hakoah members is impossible to determine because the club's membership rolls have disappeared. But for a club that was active for 29 years, 1909 to 1938, and enrolled 2,500 to 3,000 members annually at its peak, 37 deaths seems a relatively low figure. So why did so many Hakoah members survive? I would like to propose 3 reasons. Hakoah members successfully defied the Nazis because they were Austrian, because they were Zionists, and because they belonged to a sports club. Max Scheuer was one of about 65,500 Austrian Jews who died in the Holocaust. And I'm following the numbers of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here. Bearing in mind Austria's pre-war Jewish population of about 185,000, that puts the Austrian death rate at roughly 35%. That is an enormously high rate, but still lower than that in other countries, such as the Netherlands, 73%, and Poland, 90%. The relatively high survival rate of Austrian Jews speaks to the initial Nazi goal for Austria. In 1938, Eichmann's orders were to drive the Jews out of the Reich and take their money, not kill them. Austrian Jews who fled to lands outside Nazi control obviously increased their chances for survival. Hakoah's Zionist orientation played a part as well. Not all club members were committed to the cause, but a significant portion of them were. Enthusiastic Zionists were less embedded in Austrian society than assimilated Jews and were readier to leave when the situation deteriorated. Recall that 8 members of the Great Hakoah team were already out of the country by the time the Nazis arrived. 2 of those, Pollock and Hess, had emigrated to Mandate Palestine, and they would later be joined there by Nemez, Arthur Barr, and Ignaz Kerner. I also think that sports made a difference, and I think I'll end with this. Today we take it for granted that sports is a mass activity, that it's a big business, and that it's played all over the world. When did sports first become globalized in this way? It happened in Hakoah's heyday between the world wars. The Great Hakoah team was not a neighborhood club. Their players came from across Central Europe. They did not just play against local rivals. They played against British Army sides in Tel Aviv, all-star teams in New York, and cup finalists in East London. Many Hakoah footballers also played for multiple teams over the course of their careers. All this activity placed them in a network of international contacts, which proved to be a lifesaver in a time of war and extermination. Holocaust survivor and Hakoah member Karl Haber put it bluntly. The connection that we athletes had was very useful to us. Sport had saved our lives. So what was Hakoah's greatest victory? Beating West Ham may have been a Jewish world event, but the club's greatest accomplishment by far, I think, in the words of Valentin Rosenfeld, was the successful emigration of most of the members to all parts of the world. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. I knew this was going to be interesting. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
So let's open up the floor to questions. Who would like to go first?
You mentioned that the place, is this, do I? Okay. You mentioned that the players came from all over.
Yeah.
So how did they all move together then to be together as they were, forming this team?
Oh yeah, so that's a great question. Like, how does this team come together? Oh, lights, camera, action. Yeah, okay. There you all are. Good. Well, some people stayed. That's really nice. Thank you. So the team came together from, so the vast majority of Austrian Jews lived in Vienna proper. Probably 180,000 out of 185,000 actually lived in Vienna. So a lot of the Hakoah team does come from Vienna, but they actually start to draw in players from other great centers of Central European Jewish life. So they come from Prague, for example, where there's a great soccer tradition, and they come from Budapest, where there's a great soccer tradition, and they're actually recruiting throughout Central Europe, but they do come and go. So this team that's together for this match against West Ham United, the team would be slightly, one or two players would move on, and a couple of new players would come in. Actually, the next summer before they won the championship, a player actually converted to Judaism and joined the team, which was really interesting. So then there were lots of debates in the newspaper about, is this like a legitimate thing? Could you convert? And so on and so forth. So yeah, lots of ways that people join the team. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that is a lovely question. Thank you. I'd love to talk a little bit about the sources actually, because they're so fantastic. So for the PowerPoint, I tried to make it a talk rather than, here was my research trip to the Jewish Museum in Vienna and look at all the fun pictures I found. That's one huge source, is there are these great repositories of photographs and some of them are just the photo albums from the players, especially from the tours, Max Gold's 1924-25 photo album of his trip to Mandate, Palestine and Egypt, and just one beautiful photo after another. That's one huge source. The second big source is that the Hakoah folks, especially so the team manager, Arthur Barr, was able to move to Mandate, Palestine, and then became kind of the keeper of the flame and tried to keep all the Hakoah members who had scattered, of course, in this incredible diaspora around the world, tried to keep them in contact. And he wrote this enormous club history, 1959, to celebrate the 50th anniversary sorry, I should be more on the microphone so people can hear. I apologize. Wrote a beautiful club history in 1959 that includes, it's wonderful because it's not like an academic history. It's I guess that wasn't the nicest thing I could have said, possibly, but you given the present company, but you know what I mean. It's wonderful because it includes all these first-hand accounts from the players, like Willie Halpern, the goaltender, talks about joining the club and playing and moving to New York and all the rest. So you have these wonderful first-hand accounts. Then the third huge source are the newspapers. And the newspapers are incredible from Vienna in the 1920s. Okay, we are talking about a world where there are about 12 newspapers circulating daily in Vienna that you can go and read. 2 of which are devoted exclusively to sports every day. So the Hakoah coverage, so I was diligent and hired a research assistant to start helping me go through these, and he's getting back. I said, do the Hakoah season. And he gets back to me and he's like, I'm still in September. Because, it's like 12 articles every day about Hakoah. So those are the 3 major places where you can get information. Yeah. Howard.
Thanks, Michael, for that really lovely talk and a lot of fun. It was really great. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Hakoah in the sense, were there other sports? I mean, we got little snippets in which they really excelled. I doubt if there's any really similar stories, but perhaps there's some more that you can tell us about in their work.
Yeah. I chose to focus on the soccer team tonight, but there's a whole story that can be told, and in fact has been told, about the swimming team, and especially the women's swimming team. So the women's swimming team, there's this beautiful documentary that some of you will, for the hardcore out there, will know, called Watermarks, an Israeli documentary about the Hakoah women swimmers, who were absolutely amazing as athletes, but then also took this principled stance against the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, of course, and for their principled stance were promptly banned by the Austrian Swimming Federation. And that ban, I believe, was not overturned for decades and decades and decades afterwards. So yeah, the Hakoah swimmers are absolutely amazing. They used to do this race through the Danube River, through the town every year that Hakoah would often win. And we were, joking a little bit about the water polo team, but the water polo team was great. They were fantastic, and they frequently won. And Friedrich Thorberg, the great Austrian writer, actually played on championship Hakoah water polo teams as well. So yeah, lots of sports. And the water thing was really significant, right? Because of this anti-Semitic stereotype about Jews and fears of water. It even shows up, like there are these crazy caricature cartoons that are drawn in these sports newspapers that I was talking about, with the Hakoah players getting ready for their trip to America. They have to take a boat, and it's these very anti-Semitic portrayals of them like getting ready to dip their toes in the water because they're so scared of taking a boat to America. So these things really persisted.
Thank you, Michael, for a great speech. I was wondering, are there any descendants from the Hakoah? And if so, did you get a chance to meet or talk with any of them?
Yeah.
Or have they written material about their grandfathers, grandmothers, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a really, really wonderful and central question, I think. So I came to this project, I think, too late in many respects, in terms of kind of capturing the actual voices of even of the relatives of these folks. I'm sure there are relatives of these folks. It would be wonderful to track them down. I'm, of course, an historian, so I'm used to the comfort of my books, and I'm a little less comfortable in reaching out to people, but I've sort of begun that process with my first trip to Vienna, and I'm hoping to get a chance to go to Israel in a couple of months, actually, to start to track down some more, and I'm sort of on the path, but not there yet. Yeah, but wouldn't it be wonderful?
Michael, you talk wonderfully about the Viennese newspapers, but I wondered, given your story about the white-haired gentleman who disappeared, what was the British newspaper coverage?
Yeah, I know.
And
Yeah.
I'm interested in the British newspaper coverage, the British Jewish response,
Yeah.
and also American coverage in English and Yiddish.
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, we only have a couple of hours remaining, so so yes, I cut a whole section about the British newspapers because I knew we'd be here all night, but so the Daily Mail is the best article. Daily Mail, a well-known tabloid still today, but it has this article, which is this kind of crazy combination of anti-Semitic tropes combined with a stunningly accurate description of what Hakoah was trying to do. So it describes the Hakoah team as playing a clever, scientific brand of football. They were much smarter than the British team. They were something like rangy little men who played a scientific brand of football. But then at the very end, what seems to me clear is that President Kerner had actually been able to walk through the press row and kind of spin his, what are you doing? And at the very end of the article, it says, Hakoah is this team devoted to training Jewish youth to increase their physical strength so that they may be able to fight more successfully for the creation of a Jewish national homeland. It's like, what? They, totally got it. But so it's this crazy combination. The Hakoah's American tours are covered extensively in the Yiddish press in New York. This is something, my Yiddish is not great as currently constituted, but this is something that I'm hoping to dive into, maybe with a little bit of help. And there's a huge controversy. Guess what? There's a controversy. And people have a big argument, and the big argument is, should Hakoah be playing 4 of the 11 matches on the Hakoah American Tour were played on the Sabbath? Should they be playing on the Sabbath? Should they not be playing on the Sabbath? Should we be going to support the team? Yes, no. The argument rages on for weeks. Yeah, huge coverage.
Take a couple more questions. Of course, you're making me cross the room.
Did either Hitler or Eichmann ever comment on Hakoah?
That is a great question. So Hitler, somewhat notoriously, was not a soccer fan. It was not his sport, and he was not interested. Eichmann, there's a really interesting and I think a deeper story here that I need to do a lot more work on, but which I can just kind of introduce tonight, which is that the leadership of Hakoah were, of course, very significant members of the Zionist community of Vienna. And as such, they had a very significant role to play in the process of forced emigration, including Kerner. And there are some really interesting references to Kerner being compelled to work with Nazi officials. The question is, who is he working with? And that's a question that I'm still working on. Eichmann, of course, is in overall charge of Jewish immigration in Vienna, but he is not the only one there.
One more question, I think over here.
Michael, you really brought this history to life, and just I learned so much, and your youth students are so lucky to have you in the classroom. I just had a question now, because I was listening to this and watching this, but why do you think there wasn't something similar to like a Negro league baseball or baseball league in terms of parallel in European Jewry? By that I mean like, I was wondering if there's a team like in Warsaw, for example, or not team in Warsaw, but like someone similar in Warsaw that would start like a Jewish soccer club that would be a rival Hakoah or play them. Why do you think there wasn't any other clubs, just given the scope of European Jewry at the time?
So that's a really interesting, really interesting point, because so Hakoah is kind of contagious, actually. What happens when Hakoah comes to town is that people want a Hakoah of their own. And this happens in Jewish community after Jewish community after Jewish community. So what you see You see Hakoah Graz, you see Hakoah Linz, you see Hakoahs forming, and then of course other Jewish sports clubs, Bar Kokhba, Maccabee, they take on different names. The trick is that they never rival Hakoah in terms of size and in terms of sporting success. So we don't really hear as much about them. But there is a whole world of Jewish sports clubs actually in Europe between the wars. And there's this whole world of Jewish sporting life. And that's what I really love about this project, is that it's a world that is kind of being blocked out by what comes after. And I love being able to go back and show this world of Jewish sports. Yeah, thank you for that.